My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And welcome to our conversation today with Dr. Nabeel Khoury. Dr. Nabeel Khoury is a former Foreign Service officer who served for some 25 years in the Arab world in the U.S. State Department. We are delighted to have him today to talk to us about his experiences in the Arab world and what highlights he can tell us about being in the Foreign Service and service of American foreign policy in that region. Dr. Nabeel, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you.
I'd like to start first by asking you. You are an Arab American who has entered the American Foreign Service. Obviously, you are very interested in foreign policy issues for the United States, and you wanted to participate in decision making. How overall? How was your experience with that engagement?
So thank you, Imad, for conducting this interview conversation. We were supposed to have done a book event at the Arab Center around my recently published book called Bunker Diplomacy. Due to the virus situation and our various confinements, we're doing this live via Zoom. So this is a very nice opportunity. I titled my book Bunker Diplomacy, and it's sort of a political memoir that covers my 25 years in the Foreign Service. Right. The title was deliberately chosen to highlight the theme that US diplomacy moved in those 25 years towards becoming less and less public and more preoccupied with security.
Right.
The environment in which American diplomats have been conducting their work in the Middle East became more and more hostile, more and more dangerous. Right. And therefore, the kind of open door diplomacy that used to be possible at one point has become virtually impossible, especially these days.
Right. Yeah. There have been really great differences between how foreign policy over the last 30, 40 years, American foreign policy in the Middle East. There has been always an emphasis on certain supposedly American principles, the promotion of democracy and human rights and trying to protect individual rights in the Arab world and in the Middle East in general anyway. There have been, over the last 3 years specifically, a little bit of a retreat from that, at least public retreat. I know that the State Department still produces its reports on human rights issues in the Arab world and the Middle East. But generally speaking, there has been really almost like a silence on certain issues that have to do with democratization and human rights and the suppression of such in the Arab world. What's your take on this?
Well, the words democracy, human rights, democratization have always been part of the vocabulary of US diplomacy worldwide.
Right.
The problem is there was always a gap between the rhetoric and the action. What we've been talking about and what we've been really focused on. I would say over the period, certainly in which I served, but longer than that, there has been a preoccupation with security, which meant military collaboration with despotic regimes, especially after 9/11, the global war on terrorism became...
Actually, 9/11 opened the door to a whole bunch of changes in that.
Right. And so while we continue to talk about democracy and human rights, the priority in terms of budget, in terms of overall concern back in Washington was always to security, and it was a narrowly focused security,
right.
Which meant much more focus on the military and on other security agencies. Ironically, the budgetary focus and programmatic focus on democratization and human rights came under the Bush administration, GW.
Right.
As early as 2002, the Bush administration started the Middle East Partnership Initiative, MEPI.
Right.
And these programs funded civil society organizations throughout the Middle East.
Right.
It was an excellent program. The problem with it was a limited budget, which never really amounted to a large percentage of the overall US aid package, let alone US budget.
Right.
In 2004, the Bush administration also started the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation,
right.
which produced real money attached to reforms in the region. Yeah. So as a government adopted a reform package, particularly anti-corruption, developed by their own people, not by American diplomats.
Right.
It was funded to the tune of several millions.
Right.
That was an excellent program. But again, security trumped these programs. Right. So I recall in Yemen, we developed a very nice program. But the minute that the government allowed a member of al-qaeda who had been captured, but he was a member of a tribe, in order to please the tribe, they let him go.
Right, yeah.
The MCC program for Yemen was immediately stopped.
Right.
So that told me right there that despite the rhetoric and actually good programs, security still came first, and again, in a very narrow perspective on security.
Correct, yeah. In your book, Bunker Diplomacy, you basically recall basically a memoir of your service in several Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq. This is a question that is very, very broad, but try to limit your answer as much as possible. From what you've seen over 25 years of service, what really just basically jumped at you as something that was really endemic, so to speak? Not necessarily endemic in Arab society. No society has these problems just endemic in them. But what has precipitated the current state of Arab affairs? I mean, what have you noticed that really just simply jumped out at you as something? This is something that's going to really create very, very long-term problems.
Well, in a word, the Arab uprising of 2011, I would say over the years, a lot of different ideologies prevailed, came to the surface in the Arab world, from secular left-wing to religious right-wing extremists, etc.
Right.
But what happened in 2011 was so different. I was working at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the time at the State Department here.
Right.
And when things started in Egypt, it was like 1 week, and we were watching as regular people were chasing police cars, and the police
Right.
were running away from them. Yeah. And I told my colleagues, I said, this is it. This regime is going to fall.
Right.
And this is a sea change, because people were always afraid of security.
The barrier of fear was fell, right?
Yeah. So this now, of course, had a lot of implications in different countries. We've gone into chaotic situations, civil war, regional intervention. The only positive experience so far has been in Tunisia,
Right.
where the transition happened peacefully, and it's still going with lots of challenges, but going peacefully. But what happened this past year in 2019 in Iraq and in Lebanon tells me that the spirit of 2011 is still alive, and that people are really fed up of the regimes that they have
Right.
over them and want to change them. And here's the message for US foreign policy. We haven't been doing a good job listening. And by listening, I mean listening to the people, not to the governments.
Right.
The
Yeah.
slogan of the Arab uprising was "the people want the fall of the regime."
Right. Yeah.
And that's
Right.
the key phrase, "the people want." We
Right.
need to understand what the people want. And
Right.
I don't mean we need to push revolution,
Right.
but I mean, we need to be working with the forces of the future, helping them as much as we can, but helping them with educational exchanges, cultural programs, funding projects that can enhance peaceful transition to democracy in the Arab world. And I think this is what the whole movement in the Arab world is about these days.
Right. But just to push back a little bit on this, American foreign policy is, supposedly any country's foreign policy is supposed to be a continuance of a certain way of doing things. In other words, American foreign policy for the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a foreign policy that cooperated with the regimes as they were. And in the 90s, the same thing. But in the 90s, the important addition was the collapse of the Soviet Union. But still, American foreign policy continued to cooperate with these regimes. What was preventing the American establishment, the foreign policy establishment, of establishing such relations as you are saying now, such relations with the street, with the people themselves?
Well, I think partly the forces that push for the security and the military establishment, I mean, to use a very simplified term, the military industrial complex,
Correct,
which makes a lot of money from exploiting a negative security environment. But I would say politically, it's the fear on the part of politicians of losing short-term security for long-term security. You need someone with a vision, a leader with a vision, who understands that long-term national security interests of the US lie with a democratic, stable Arab world. Correct. And therefore, working with civil society leaders, working with the media, working with the people of the region, is in the interests of the US. It's not just in the interests of the region.
Yeah, that's correct.
And that's a very difficult thing for someone to grasp. I think President Obama understood it, but he wasn't bold enough in making the shift from collaborating with security establishments of the region to collaborating fully with the people and with their civil society leaders.
Yeah, that's true. In your service, I read the book, and it's really very, very rich with all kinds of number one news and analysis about certain different countries. You point out definite successes in some places and real failures in others of American foreign policy. Morocco with the success with civil society organizations. Yemen, the failure with the security issues. So, how involved or how could you have influenced things? And you did influence, obviously, things on the soft power spectrum, so to speak. But what were the impediments for broadening the reach of people like you who wanted to work on the soft side of foreign policy?
I think there's a lot of talent in the State Department among Foreign Service officers who truly understand the region. And we need to encourage people, diplomats, to go out beyond the limited sphere of government to government contacts and understand the culture and work with the culture. I remember I was a consul general in Casablanca in Morocco. I was also a press attaché before that. And my deepest contacts were with the leaders of civil society, which is a very strong force in Morocco. I remember in Casablanca, I put on a jeans and a t-shirt and walked the streets with members of an organization called Beiti at the time, which was trying to help street children. So I went with them to see how they do their work and is it really worthwhile? And I was so impressed with it. I was able to acquire a nice grant for them from the State Department, from the Middle East Partnership Initiative. And that I felt not only accomplished in the sense I helped with something important, but I also felt that my understanding of social and economic problems in Morocco grew tremendously with this one activity. In Yemen, although I was the deputy chief of mission, often in charge of all embassy operations, I made the time to go out and talk to civil society and talk to the media. And I remember meeting Tawakkul Karman, who was at the time the head of a women journalists organization. And I was able to develop a friendship with her, which has lasted all these years, before and after she won the Nobel Prize for being one of the leaders of the Arab uprising in Yemen in 2011. But those visits to media, which wasn't very prominent at the time, but it was talking to the young men and women of the future of Yemen. And although I enjoyed my relationship with Ali Abdullah Saleh tremendously, but I think the most benefit for US diplomacy and for me personally came from contacts with people like Tawakkul Karman and her colleagues, many of them.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your book, I mean, there are some really very nice anecdotes in there about specific person-to-person talking to people like this, and you feel that that the Arab world is not bereft of people who want to do good things, and it's just that the Arab regimes have constricted people's activities, people's abilities to do certain things, and thus they just simply were sidelined. I want to shift just a little bit to just ask you about, from your experiences as a Foreign Service officer, but also from your general knowledge of the area, what are specifically some really daunting challenges facing the Arab world today?
Well, I think liberalizing the Arab world, essentially the transition towards democracy, transition towards equal rights for men, women, for different ethnic and religious groups. And the main challenge in this is no doubt taking place, and it's the biggest thing happening in the region. The main challenge is for those who are struggling, working towards this, to be able to work together peacefully, to be able to form partnerships regardless of perhaps different ideological perspectives. The Tunisians were able to do that. Everywhere else, no. If you look at Yemen, Yemen has been going through a horrendous civil and regional war. And it started out as the poorest country in the region, and now it's been devastated by hunger, disease, and death. Now, of course, there is a strong regional intervention in Yemen and international. The US is guilty of enforcing a siege on Yemen, which is devastating the country. But I think in the end, the Yemenis are fighting other Yemenis.
Right. Yeah.
And they belong to different tribes, different regions of Yemen, and different ideologies. Right. I think if the Yemenis got together and were able to get over their differences and accept one another and work with one another as equals, right, then nobody, no force in the region or the world could do what has been done to them. Right. And this is the real challenge for them. And I think this is a challenge for all the democracy-loving people across the Arab world.
Right. This is a political science question, and I'm sure you'll have a
as an old political scientist myself,
a good answer for it. But yeah, is it because the Arab world generally, except for the Gulf region, obviously, where there is these are oil-rich states and they have a lot of oil revenue. Is it an economic issue? In other words, is development more economic than political and social, or vice versa?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I think they're both important, the economic side and the political side. In each country, it's different. In some places, you always need the economic means of power to be able to exert yourself. Right. But I mean, in some countries, it emphasizes one more than the other. The conditions for social change in Morocco are not the same as the conditions for social and political change in Saudi Arabia or in the Arab Emirates. Right. So in each country, I think for civil society, which is working towards change, yeah, in some cases, they need to form a political party. I think in Lebanon, for example, given the strength of the sectarian system and the various political parties and their militias, for civil society to succeed in the goals that they have been pushing, they need to form a force outside the sectarian system. Right. Okay. And put together an agenda, a very clear agenda. And in order to be able to work this agenda systematically, they need an organization, which thus far they have lacked. But in other countries, in Morocco, for example, I don't think they need to form a political party because the field for civil society organizations has been open for 2 decades in Morocco. Right. And they are effective in playing outside the government and outside the political arena. Right. So in each country, it's a little different. Yeah. In some places, you need to control resources. In other places, all you need is good organization and a sound agenda.
That's correct, yeah. I want to ask you about the religious versus secular divide. We know that Arab society is so-called very traditional and bound to religious practices and religion, but then the Arab citizens are not necessarily all religious citizens. In other words, there is a place for secular thinking. Where do you think that is going?
So to some extent, there is an analogy here with medieval Europe when the Catholic Church was a political and economic power and sometimes an empire and a corrupt one. And it had a tremendous influence with religious symbols over millions. Eventually, it was toppled by force because those who were opposed to its power became stronger.
Right.
I think in the Arab world right now, in most places, the religious forces, and here we don't have one organized force like the Catholic Church. We have groups, we have states that adopt the ideology of conservative religious groups, but that religious force is still very strong. And unfortunately, the secular voices that speak up against it get shouted down and get thrown in jail because they challenge religious symbols. That needs to go on, but I think in the end what you need is a dialogue within the religious establishment itself. Eons ago, I wrote my PhD dissertation on Muhammad Abdu, who around the turn of the 20th century was a reformist within the Islamic structure. He challenged the values of Al-Azhar, and he reformed Al-Azhar as much as he could. Unfortunately, for millions in the Arab world, you cannot challenge Islam itself. You cannot challenge the duty of a Muslim to be religious. But from within that structure, you can challenge the interpretation of Islam. And somebody who is a liberal thinker and who understands that there are core values in religion, and then there are details that are often superfluous or historically focused. And therefore, going to the core of religious values, you can say this particular custom is really not necessary, is not consistent with the core value of Islam. That kind of dialogue has not been taking place, unfortunately. And you need intellectuals and scholars from within Islam to challenge prevailing notions that are no longer of service to the region.
That's correct. That's right. There has to be some sort of a reform movement, so to speak, that can address the extremism that is not necessarily, that shouldn't necessarily be there. That could also address how the states stop exploiting religion for their own benefit, and how rulers stop exploiting religion as well.
Exactly. I think these despotic states often use religious extremism to their own advantage. And you find governments, Saudi Arabia, others, throwing people in jail supposedly for challenging religion. And like, what business is it of yours to be defending religious tenets when you are a secular authority? And this is where democracy helps, that as you democratize, the state can no longer do that. And you allow in a democracy multiple voices to thrive.
That's correct. Well, Dr. Nabeel Khoury, I mean, we can go on discussing the Arab world for a long, long time. We really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much for your insights, and thank you for your service. And we hope to be seeing you soon on other platforms. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Imad, and we look forward to doing this in person.
Thank you, sir.